Tonight on Greater Boston, I'm Sue O'Connell in for Jim Browdy. We'll take a look at how COVID and a nationwide staffing shortage have been a source of stress for pharmacists and a threat to patient safety. The outgoing and incoming presidents of the Massachusetts Association of Pharmacists join me. Then later, some conservative Supreme Court justices have signaled that after Roe is dead, they're coming for same-sex marriage next. Is that likely to happen? And what would that mean for Massachusetts and beyond? The past 2.5 years have been hard on everyone, but essential workers have borne the brunt of the burden. And that includes pharmacists who've been putting themselves at risk to keep their communities healthy, with many expanding their services to include COVID, testing, and vaccines while dealing with widespread staffing shortages. These conditions are not only stressful and potentially dangerous for pharmacists, they're dangerous for patients too. More than 3/4 of pharmacy workers say they don't have enough time to do their responsibilities, including patient care and clinical work, safely. According to a recent survey from the American Pharmacists Association and the National Alliance of State Pharmacy Associations. I'm joined now by two leaders of the Massachusetts Association of Pharmacists, Saad Dinno, the group's current president, who's also a registered pharmacist, and the president of Dinno Health Pharmacies, and Ryann Abrams, the group's president-elect and manager of pharmacy operations at Rite Aid. Congratulations to both of you for incoming and outgoing, first of all.
Thank you.
I want to start with you, Saad. Just talk about what the stressors have been for pharmacists in general over the past 2.5 years during the COVID pandemic.
Sure. Thank you so much Sue, for having me. I think one of the number one stressors has been trying to keep up with current aspects of COVID, because the last 2.5 years we've done with COVID. It started by masking, and then starting by making sure that we have the right aspects of our pharmacy covered, so the interaction between patient and our staff is at minimum, distance wise was abiding by the current guidelines. And then after that, I think especially for me, from owning 4 independent pharmacies, my 70+ staff were absolutely tremendous. Every single one of them stepped up to the plate whenever needed. And thankfully, we survived the hardest times of COVID. But now with Omicron, since September, November, December time period, things have changed a bit from a staffing perspective. But I think the stresses was just trying to keep up with the current CDC guidelines, trying to have the most absolute, correct information in front of us to provide our clients and customers. And then on top of that, just trying to do the daily aspects that we do on as pharmacists and pharmacy staff on a daily basis.
Right, Ryan, I want to back up a little bit and go pre-COVID to chat with you. In my household, we have a number of people with chronic illnesses, and I think we have some 20 prescriptions that we have to get filled on a regular basis. We go to a chain pharmacy in our neighborhood. I live in Boston. There's multilingual, multi-languages and needs that our pharmacist has to address. Before COVID, I was always in awe of how the 2 or 3 pharmacists I know worked there had so much work to do, and how the staff did. A shout out to Marie at CVS and in JP, how hard they all worked at trying to arrange things. What was the situation for pharmacists and staff going into the pandemic? Were they as stressed as it seemed to me, although excellent but stressed?
Yeah, I mean, pharmacists have been remarkable throughout. Their pharmacists are not strangers to working hard, to the physical aspects of the job. I mean, those physical demands, you're on your feet. You have a lot of moving pieces in any given day in a pharmacy. So pharmacists prior to the pandemic were no strangers to the physical demands, no strangers to the mental demands either. I mean, you're constantly thinking about patient safety. That's always forefront in your mind, getting to know your customers and your patients, and making sure they have what they need. So that's, that didn't change. The biggest change that I think COVID brought was that emotional piece. We've always had those emotional connections with our patients and our customers, but there was just so much more because, we had that much more of a need. People that were coming in that we had never seen before, asking us for advice and for recommendations, if they were sick, if they were healthy. we were seeing it all. So that was a big change that happened, just that emotional piece. I mean, there was a lot of stress. Patients brought that in to the pharmacist. They had a lot of questions. There was, sometimes some anger, sadness, and we were dealing with all of it. So combine it all together was really, a tough combination, but pharmacists were remarkable. They were resilient and steadfast, and really, just going into the stores and that the world has changed outside, where everything got flipped upside down in a minute. And then you would walk into the pharmacy and it was like nothing had changed. Maybe a mask,
Yeah.
but they were still there just doing their jobs, getting it done. They were there for their community. They were there for their customers and their patients. And it was remarkable. And, I'm so proud of our pharmacists. I work for Rite Aid. I'm proud of our pharmacists at Rite Aid, but all the pharmacists that just continue to, keep on going throughout.
So I witnessed actually at my pharmacy a sort of game of telephone in translation between one of the pharmacy workers, the pharmacy technicians, the pharmacist, and a client, a customer who was had some mis or disinformation about COVID and was asking questions at a very busy time where they were carefully and patiently explaining, get the vaccine, you need to get the vaccine. I think Ryan has touched on this a little bit, but what's the toll that all of this has taken on pharmacists, and why should we as customers be concerned about it?
Well, so we've handled. I think if you ask any of my staff members, Sue, is number one complaint from them is the amount of phone calls that we've handled over the past 2 years, and it's all because our customers are looking for us as accessible healthcare providers, as pharmacists, very accessible to our communities and our staff. To our community and our customers and patients. It's just answering all those phone calls one after the other, especially when it came to vaccines and scheduling and et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, I mentioned before, on top of taking care of our daily aspects of taking care of our patients that rely on our services on every day, that added a lot of stress. That added, I think I was, checking on more of my staff than any time I've been a pharmacist for 30 over years and the owner. And, I kept checking on them every day because I was concerned about the stress level that all these phone calls, all these extra work has caused. And, like I said, they handle it with an amazing, efforts and assistance, but you can see on their face that it gets tiresome a little bit after a while. But we had a mission, and that was to take care of our patients.
So Ryan, it was news recently when one of the chains made an announcement that the pharmacy was going to be closed between noon and 1 so that the staff and the pharmacist could take lunch, and that was a little shocking to me that actually had to be something that was done. It just wasn't happening naturally, that a pharmacist who's got a very high stress job with a very low ability to make any mistakes had to make sure that they were protected for lunchtime. What are you and the Massachusetts Association of Pharmacists, what are you looking for, or are you looking for changes or accommodations during this period to both help the pharmacists and to keep their accuracy at the high level that it usually is?
Yeah, I mean, workplace safety, patient safety is certainly on the forefront of our mission and what we want to do as an association. We represent pharmacists and pharmacy professionals throughout the Commonwealth and that work in all different settings. So although their community pharmacist is probably your most visible pharmacist, pharmacists exist pretty much in every aspect of healthcare, in hospitals and clinic settings, in independent practice, consulting, long-term care. So, pharmacists work in a number of different settings, and we represent all of them. We want pharmacists to be able to, use their expertise and what they're trained to do and work at the highest level of their license. And so to do that, we'll certainly advocate for laws and legislation that will allow pharmacists to do that, those top of scope activities. Every pharmacist I've interviewed, we want to help people. That's really what we want to do. And sometimes we need those, rules and regulations in place to allow us to do that safely and effectively.
So as difficult as the past years have been, I know that Dr. Anthony Fauci was on with Jim and Marjorie on Boston Public Radio today, and we have talked about the Fauci effect, right? That there have been a number of people, young people coming out of high school and college who have decided to choose a career in medicine because of what they've seen in the inequities and challenges that COVID has exposed. Are you seeing more interest, a greater demand of young people and individuals who are choosing to go into the pharmacy practice or get their pharmacy degree? As college enrollment up in that world?
I mean, in general, the enrollment of pharmacists is somewhat at a plateau right now, Sue. So, but speaking of I had a high school student today start a 3-week internship from a local high school because she's interested in pharmacy. So, the pharmacy has always been a profession where, again, as my colleague Ryan mentioned, we're here to help patients and customers. That's our number one mission. A lot of these young individuals come, ask us and, come in and interview us as to why we are a pharmacist, and they're baffled as to how much interaction we have with patients and how much accessible we are to the customers. And it's an incredible profession. We have some issues to deal with, in regards to work aspects and long hours and dealing with a payment model that's probably not sustainable for the future, but it's a great profession. A lot, my son is graduating as a 3rd generation pharmacist next, in a couple of days from pharmacy. So, there's a lot of young men and women that have chosen this profession, which is an absolutely great profession in health, and healthcare providers is what we're after, and we deserve that status.
Ryan, what can we do as customers? I mean, or as the folks that are on the receiving end of the gifts and skills of the pharmacists and their and the technicians and everyone working behind that plexiglass. What can we do to help? Or I know we should be checking our pills and reading the instructions and asking questions, looking at the pills to make sure they're the right pills that they are on the description. But when it just comes to the actual interaction with the pharmacies, what can we do to be better community members?
Well, we're there to help our community. I think it's great when community values their pharmacist. So I would just say continue to value what your pharmacist can provide. Continue to be a champion for those services that the pharmacist is giving their customers and their communities. Whether it's going out and doing flu clinics or going to schools and local businesses and organizations, we really are interwoven into the fabric of our communities. So I would just say, value what your pharmacist can do. Know that we do so much more than just dispense pills. I think that's the biggest thing, is to know that we're capable and we do so much more. Our jobs are important. And then if there is any legislation or action supporting pharmacists, we hope that you can support that in that respect, because that'll be a big piece of evolving our profession and moving it forward.
Saad, I'll give you the last word. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think we hear from our customers all the time, and Sue, you being a customer as well of a pharmacy, is that I'm going to call you first. I'm going to try to get the answer from you first before I contact my other providers, because I know I could reach you. I know I'm potentially, if you don't know the answer, you're going to get the correct, you're going to search it for me. I just tell the consumers and customers, ask questions. Don't leave a pharmacy without knowing what your medication is all about. Know the interactions, know the side effects, et cetera, et cetera. That is our job as pharmacists. That's why we went to school. We know medications. We're the experts of medications. Please ask questions. Don't hesitate. That is why we're there. That's why we are there for you, for our consumers and customers in our communities.
Saad Dinno, Ryann Abrams, thanks so much, and thanks to all of the pharmacists who have been doing the hard work over the past 2.5 years and beyond and forward. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks
for having us.
When a draft Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade leaked last week, it sent shockwaves through the nation as a 50-year right to safe and legal abortion seemed to evaporate in an instant. And it looked like other reproductive rights, like birth control, might be on the future chopping block as well. And as if that weren't bad enough, Justice Alito's majority decision may have left the door open to future attacks on other important and hard-won rights. Chief among them, same-sex marriage. Joining me to discuss is Mary Bonato, Civil Rights Project Director for the GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, also known as GLAD, and Arline Isaacson, President of Isaacson Political Consulting and a volunteer co-chair at the Massachusetts Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus. So sadly, it looks like we're getting the band back together again here, folks, which I'm happy to see you, but not thrilled about the conversation we're about to have, as you two were key to securing the marriage rights for Americans. Mary, I want to start with you first, because you're the lawyer and I'm not, so I want to ask you some questions.
Sure.
Can you just tell us and explain it to me so I can understand how the right to same-sex marriage is like a Jenga piece or a domino piece on top of the right to a legal abortion?
Okay, let's try to unpack that for a second. So first of all, just starting with the abortion part of this, there's no doubt that this opinion is deeply disturbing. I know it's a draft, but I don't expect the final to be less disturbing. And I say that in part because of the framework, and that's what's going to be your connection for us, okay? So, you just have to remember that the 14th Amendment, which was born in the aftermath of the Civil War, and which really remade our nation, used the Declaration of Independence for inspiration to finally do what we had meant to do back in 1776 and say, we all have liberty, we're all born free and equal. And that promise had been betrayed because of the institution of slavery and Civil War, and then was remade in these Reconstruction Amendments in the 14th Amendment, which promises us all liberty and equality as well. So the reason that these are connected, marriage and abortion, is because abortion also finds its roots in the idea of privacy at the time, but really the constitutional text is about liberty, that people have a right to make some very important decisions for themselves, that some rights are so important that they are fundamental to the individual and not for the government to decide. Marriage is such a thing too. Intimacy is such a thing too. Using contraception is such a thing also. So what has happened over the years is that the court has gotten quite aggressive about saying it's not for us to decide what's a fundamental right. The Constitution doesn't mention it. The Constitution doesn't mention a lot of things that get discussed in legal opinions, I'm going to say. The Constitution doesn't mention it, and we have to look to history, and this opinion goes back to the 13th century at a time when women didn't really have legal standing. To say we have to look back in history and has this right been protected? And in fact, and then they get into, well, was this specific right protected for these specific people? But fundamental rights are not determined by who was excluded from them in the past. And we've had plenty of precedent in this nation that I think the Supreme Court looked past to respect people's bodily integrity and decisions about how they conduct their most private affairs. And the court didn't want to go there, at least in this draft opinion. So this is concerning not only for abortion, it's concerning for other rights as well, as you mentioned, including marriage, although I have more to say about that.
We'll get back to that in a second. Arline, I want to talk to you about the political part of it a little bit. I had been hearing for decades as folks were looking at Roe v. Wade and comparing it to, rights in other countries like in Great Britain, and also talking about same-sex marriage, that, the weakness that Roe had was that it didn't move through the court system or through the law system or through, there weren't laws and public opinions and people didn't get to vote on it. So it was just this legal opinion rather than being held up by people voting for it as same-sex marriage has. As terrifying as this is as an attack on a potential attack on same-sex marriage, are you feeling a little bit better that at least for same-sex marriage we have a history of people voting to support it through their state laws and through their city laws in other ways? It's not just the Supreme Court ruling on it?
Would that we could count on that. You're right about Massachusetts. We have the blessings of being in a state that has voted to protect our right to same-sex marriage. And we are, unlike some states that criminalize sexual behavior between consenting adults in private, there are many states where that's illegal and or criminal. And so we're lucky we don't face all of those challenges here. But the fact of the matter is there are a lot of states that would love to eliminate the right to marry. The religious right in particular is hungry. They're chomping at the bit to be able to do this. And if this ends up being the Supreme Court's final decision, as we suspect it will be, yeah, they're going to be gunning for us too. This does not affect just people who care about reproductive rights, although a lot of LGBTQs do. But this affects our marriage rights. This potentially, it affects our right to sexual intimacy. As Mary said, contraception is implicated by this potentially. So this goes far beyond repro rights, and it will happen in other states. There's no question. Remember, a lot of states have on their books already prohibitions against the right to marry, and they just were overridden by the Supreme Court years ago.
And also states have the right to fire people, many states, if they're gay or lesbian as well. That's still something that's out there. We don't have that federal protection. I want to take a look at an excerpt from Alito's draft opinion. The inescapable conclusion is that a right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions. And Mary, I want to get your take on that. I've heard a number of people say things like, well, one of the reasons that abortion wasn't in the founders weren't concerned about it is they looked at it sort of as a medical decision, a personal decision. There's no right to get your tooth pulled in the Constitution either. They didn't feel the need to make sure that you had the right to do that. What's your take about this deeply rooted phrase that Alito uses several times in it?
Well, there's been a contest at the Supreme Court for years about how to determine whether something is a fundamental right when it's not specifically named in the Constitution, as most things are not. And one of them is this idea that it's deeply rooted, but it depends on how you look at it. Do you look for the specific practice of abortion and what state laws were in 1868 when the Constitution was ratified? Do you look at state constitutional provisions, or as others have argued, I shouldn't say argued, other Supreme Court decisions have stated, you look to the traditions we've had and the traditions we've left behind. You look to this idea that we can't always know what liberty is in 2022, measured by 1922 or certainly 13th century standards. So it's really this contest going on, and that very framing of the issue is part of the problem here. Because, is there a longstanding right to sexual intimacy, to marriage of same-sex couples, to contraception? Those each have to be considered on their own merits, I will say. But that's the kind of analysis that's very concerning here. It's very, very constricted and is really intended to limit the freedom and equality, I think, that we were promised in the 14th Amendment when our country was remade.
Arline, go ahead, Arline.
Alito has asserted that this will apply only to abortion. But to me, that feels like a legal equivalent of saying, don't you worry your pretty little head about this. We won't come after your other rights. But the fact of the matter is, they're coming after a right that's been in place for 50 years. And there's no reason to believe, knowing how rabidly some of the religious right feels about our rights and our equality, they will be coming after us. And maybe Alito won't vote against us, but the next justice might.
Arline, this is an interesting moment. I mean, we're all old enough to remember having discussions with our gay brothers when we would talk about how important the right to abortion was to the what we would then call the gay community. And they would say, why do I care about abortion? What would that have to do with me? Abortion's not an LGBTQ right. It's not an issue that we should be concerned about. And I'm wondering if Arline, you feel that there's a moment of just people coming together and understanding how intersectionally all of our rights around our own bodies and what we do with them are connected, and how they are under assault, and if this might be a moment where the common enemy returns and the Democrats and the progressives and the LGBTQ community get together and actually are able to let the Democrats hold the Senate and the House when the midterms come, or is this just going to be another battle where people say, I'm not going to vote, there's no perfect choice?
You're raising an important point. Although, of course, there are plenty of people in the LGBTQ community who have the need to an abortion, not simply because they may have been sexually assaulted and raped, but perhaps they just aren't ready to build a family at this point, or they find out there's a fatal fetal anomaly of some kind. But above and beyond that, it's all about what we can do in the privacy of our homes with our bodies, which is the common thread throughout all of this. And yes, in Congress, you're absolutely right, Sue. Mitch McConnell and the conservative Republicans in Congress are already talking about amending the law in Congress to prohibit abortion rights across the country. If they can do that, they can appreciate, they can do the same thing with our rights as well. It's an extraordinarily dangerous precedent.
Mary, you've argued in front of the Supreme Court a few times, and I'm just wondering what was your reaction? What was your feelings when this draft opinion was leaked?
Well, Justice Alito and I had a great time at the oral argument in Obergefell. He was very vigorous. This was Justice Scalia, which is fine. It's part of their job. But I will say that all of these issues were previewed. So when I saw the draft opinion, I will say that even though you expect it, and even though it really reads like a lot of things I've read from them before, it was still shocking to see it and to reverse something that had not only been approved 50 years ago, but reaffirmed repeatedly, and to have it characterized as something that never had any basis in law and only in policy, as though our liberties are really that ephemeral. So I have to admit, I was shocked. And I do want to say quickly that in Massachusetts, we not only have the vote, we have a constitutional adjudication from the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which means marriage is not going away here. And so I think that that's important for people to remember. I mean, again, I say that, and who the heck knows what the future brings, but our rights, unlike those in many other states, are not contingent on what the Supreme Court does in this situation. And I do want to say that for all of the concern that we all very legitimately have, I think many of us are determined to point out all of the ways in which nationwide marriage equality is already supported in the law, has many different bases. It's not all going to turn on how the court has, construed Roe and Casey. So I just want to put that out there at the same time that I want to say that I believe this draft opinion is deeply, deeply wrong and deeply damaging.
Mary Bonato and Arline, I got to leave it there, but I'm sure we'll talk about this more. I have no doubt about that. Arline Isaacson, Mary Bonato, thank you so much for joining me. That's it for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Each night on Greater Boston, we go in depth on important stories. We talk to the people behind those stories, and we bring you expert insight and a wide array of views on issues which you care about and which you should. Greater Boston, Monday through Thursday at 7.